Welcome. I'm so glad that you've taken this step to learn more about human trafficking in North Carolina. I'm Pam Strickland, the founder of North Carolina Stop Human Trafficking and a part of the grant team that produced this film. We all need to learn about human trafficking so that we can identify it and report it when we see it. But human trafficking can be a difficult issue, so I want you to take care of yourself. If you see something that disturbs you, please feel free to take a break. Not all of the material in this film is appropriate for all ages. We suggest that students be at least middle school age or older. The most important voice in the anti-human trafficking movement is the voice of the survivor. We will hear from 3 courageous survivors sharing their stories about being trafficked in North Carolina. We wish we could share more. Obviously, not every trafficking scenario will be represented. Each survivor's story is individual and is their own to tell. This film is not intended to suggest a correct way to recover from human trafficking. We just want you to understand that healing is possible. There are many roads to recovery and dozens of agencies right here in North Carolina that strive to help survivors on their journey. At the end of the film, we'll share several with you. Please join me now as we seek to understand human trafficking in North Carolina.
North Carolina is a beautiful state full of natural resources. It's a tourist destination, bringing in $22 billion per year. It has fertile soil and a mild climate that grows tobacco, sweet potatoes, and more, making agriculture a $92 billion industry. North Carolina is home to 7 military bases, contributing $100 billion to the state economy, and interstate highways make traveling in, out, and within the state a breeze. All of these attributes, in addition to other characteristics, combine to make North Carolina a hub for human trafficking. Human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act.
You know, the best explanation I've heard about what human trafficking is from Dr. Lauren Bethel. It's that it is an exploitation of vulnerability. And so within the U.S., we define human trafficking according to sex and labor trafficking. And it is the use of force, fraud, and coercion for commercial sex act or forced labor.
North Carolina's agriculture industry requires thousands of migrant workers every year. Many of them come through the H-2A visa program. Through this program, 21,000 workers, most from Mexico, came to the U.S. in 2018. Thousands more work in North Carolina fields without a visa. All of them are vulnerable to labor trafficking.
The layperson's definition of labor trafficking would be where an entity or an individual uses physical force or non-physical means of coercion, like debt or threats of harm, or even fraud, false misrepresentation, to trick someone or trap someone into working against their will. I think in just focusing on sex trafficking, we're really doing North Carolinians a disservice. For a host of reasons. There are a number of reports globally and nationally showing that by and far, labor trafficking is the majority of trafficking that's occurring in our world. But also because I think understanding labor trafficking and labor exploitation helps us to better understand how to investigate and prosecute sex trafficking. And when you leave those communities and you come to work in a foreign community where you might not know where the resources are, and you're living in a migrant labor camp where an extraordinary number of aspects of your life are controlled by an employer, sometimes that makes you vulnerable to exploitation. And that can even lead to human trafficking.
Yo fui contratado por una persona en Florida y así como yo viajé a Norte Carolina.
So these farm workers were in their community in Fort Pierce, Florida, as the Florida agricultural season was wrapping up, and they responded to an ad that they saw recruiting migrant farm workers for work in North Carolina. And when they called, they were put in touch with the Baltazar family. The Baltazar family promised these farm workers, including our two clients, that they would have immediate work, ample job hours offered in cucumbers and tobacco. They would be provided housing free of charge with a labor camp kitchen where they could prepare and cook their own meals, and that they would be providing transportation to the job from Fort Pierce, Florida to North Carolina free of charge. And it sounded like an attractive offer to our clients, and so they accepted.
Todo venía pagado, nosotros no teníamos que pagar nada. Cuando los fuimos contratados, dijeron que teníamos cocina, pero ya cuando estábamos en el campamento, dijeron que nadie podía meter en la cocina, nadie podía usar. Venimos al campamento y éramos 35 personas y dijo que nadie tenía derecho de salir, de irse, y que teníamos una deuda de $200 por persona de Raite de Florida a Norte Carolina, y que teníamos que pagar $9 de comida por cada tiempo de comida. Era un total de $18 diario de comida.
The meals that they were provided were not enough to sustain our clients, two adult men at that time. And so what they were doing also to supplement their meals was fishing in like a swamp that was behind the labor camp. And then they made a makeshift outdoor kitchen where they would cook this fish from the swamp nearby to supplement their meals. Their contractors, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., would be around the camp or in the fields, always armed. And he subjected them to armed bed checks when some workers tried to leave. The labor camp was set pretty far back from the public road. So you had to kind of drive through a little gate and then up a very long, sandy dirt path to get to the labor camp. And the worker barracks were in the back of the camp. And between the worker barracks and the road to get to the public road was where the traffickers, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., stayed. And so they stayed there so they could watch and make sure that the workers weren't trying to escape without paying this surprise transportation debt and their meal fees. So the workers that were housed in the camp were frustrated and concerned. They were now told that they could not leave without repaying a debt. They had, for this transportation fee, they had no way to repay the debt because there really wasn't that much work that was being provided to them. And they had mounting debt every day because they were locked out of the labor camp kitchen and had to pay their contractors for meals. And so you've got this pressure of this debt you now have to pay and then mounting debt. You're thinking when the season really starts and there's a significant number of hours for me to work, all of my salary is then going to go to this debt and I'm still going to be left with nothing. Some of the workers escaped, and there were several waves of workers escaping. And after workers escaped the first time, their contractors, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., rounded them up and, brandishing weapons and telling them that they were not allowed to leave without repaying their debts. And if they tried to leave, then they had bullets in their guns for them. Another group of workers left in the middle of the night, and I think they left in the middle of the night to prevent detection by the crew leaders, including Junior Baltazar. And when that happened, our clients, including Mr. Rivas, heard the gunshots and assumed that those workers were being shot at. And then Junior Baltazar entered their room, flipped the lights on in the middle of the night, holding a weapon, and had them counting off to see who was left in the camp. And this was very powerful and kept these workers, including our two clients, in that situation and made them think that they could not leave. They tricked them into sort of leaving the comfort of the community where they knew how to access things, into taking this leap of faith and coming to work for them, in a different state, which happened to be North Carolina, to force them to work. We don't typically see force, fraud, and coercion in all of our trafficking cases. But this case certainly was an example where they employed all of those means to keep someone in the situation and with the intention of forcing them to work. We did ultimately, represented those workers to achieve a settlement with the migrant housing provider. And in that settlement, one of the provisions was that if they were going to be operating the camp for a certain period of time in the future, they had to install landline telephone in the worker barracks with a human trafficking poster that had information about human trafficking and the Polaris hotline number. Our clients had the benefit of working with some really amazing case managers. This was when we were just really at the cusp of forging relationships with professionals and other disciplines to serve human trafficking survivors. And so we were able to refer Mr. Rivas to a case manager in another state who helped him to stabilize. He's now been reunited with his family in a safe place, and has, through the help of the case manager and through his own power and drive, has been able to move on from this trafficking situation.
Que la gente es para trabajar, no es para que abusen de ellos, para que no es que los traten mal, que la gente sea libre, que no sea esclavizada, porque nosotros emigrantes venimos a trabajar duro, pero no nos gusta que los traten mal. Eso nomás quiero decirle a las personas que contratan gente, que tengan un poco de compasión con nosotros.
Agriculture isn't the only industry to exploit vulnerable people for their labor. Victims of labor trafficking have been found in North Carolina restaurants, construction sites, nail salons, livestock handling operations, traveling sales crews, gyms, Christmas tree farms, as well as in homes doing domestic work, in hair braiding salons, meatpacking plants, poultry processing plants, and even as part of begging rings.
Other areas of labor trafficking that my agency has worked with survivors from has been in hostessing situations. We also have worked with people trying to come out of strip clubs as well. We've worked with people that have also been trafficked through what is commonly being looked at as sports scholarships as well, where there's undue labor around these aspects, and also additional labor and fundraising that's being looked at within that. I really just want to point this out because it can be anywhere and it can be anyone.
Anywhere where you have a highly migrant, low-wage worker population, where often their housing is controlled by their employer, maybe their access to healthcare, to information, obviously their pay. They're isolated from their families, they're isolated from the community. They may also be there with an immigration status that is tethered to their employer, and that can be incredibly powerful. And so and can be used to traffic someone and force them to work against their will. In one of those cases, it was a contractor who was trafficking a member of their family to work in the fields, but then also be a domestic servant for their family. In another case, it was just domestic work in the home, cooking, cleaning. They also provided them to a business, but also collected their paycheck at the end of the day, so that they actually didn't have access to the pay that they were earning at that business.
Why is there sex trafficking in North Carolina? Because there are sex buyers in North Carolina. And if there is demand for commercial sex, traffickers will meet that demand.
Sex trafficking is just the horrendous act of exploiting people. And of course, there's force involved, there's some form of coercion or fraud, but it's any time that you take advantage of that individual, their dreams, their passions, their need for connection, their vulnerability, and you use them to profit yourself. And that exploitation to me is so degrading and so devaluing. It really rips the humanity out of someone. And the sad thing is I'll reach out to these clients and we're discussing things that they face, and they'll begin to share, I just never knew anybody could love me again, because they've been so brainwashed to believe they were worthless.
I grew up in a small town. I was an excellent student. I had dance classes from the age of 3 to the age of 15. I was a cheerleader in school. I made excellent grades. I had 3 older brothers. My mother and my father were married. They were together. So I had a pretty normal upbringing. There was a little bit of trauma in my home life as far as arguments and stuff like that, but I was never physically abused or sexually abused. And I had a pretty good childhood, to be honest with you. When I was about 13 or 14, I just always felt like I didn't fit in with anybody else. And the group of people that I found where I felt like I could be myself and where I felt like I fit in, they were the ones that smoked pot. They were the ones that skipped school. They were the ones that snuck out of the house at night. They were the ones that were doing bad stuff, and that was never a lifestyle that I had been exposed to, and it was exciting for me, and I felt like I had finally found my tribe. When I met my first trafficker, I was 19 years old, and the way that I was introduced to prostitution and trafficking is that first I was manipulated. I was given drugs, and I formed a habit. The habit was given to me. I didn't form it myself. It was actually placed in my hand and given to me for the purposes of trafficking. I didn't realize this until years later, but I was 19 years old, the first time that I ever experienced having to have sex or perform sexual acts in exchange for drugs. I was recruited by another female while I was in rehab with her. And she told me that, look, we have this house, there's this man, he will take care of you, you don't have to worry about being homeless, you don't have to worry about not having food to eat, you don't have to worry about buying your drugs, all you have to do is come here and work. And by work, I prostitute. And so he is actual business owner, if that makes any sense. And that's how it was hidden from the community. It was disguised as an escort service. We were advertised as exotic dancers. There was no exotic dancing in it. I never once went on a call where I did exotic dancing. It was always, always, always sex and sexual acts in exchange for money. He would take half of the money. In exchange, he would give us a place to live, food to eat, supply us with drugs. And I was arrested one time, and I was so distraught that, you know, I was trying to get away from a trafficker, and I was arrested. And when I got to this little country police station, it wasn't the city jail or anything like that, it was just out in the country. I was cornered by 5 police officers who were all men, and they told me that I had to take my clothes off so that they could search me. When I was a little girl, I had dreams. I wanted to be an attorney. That was my biggest dream. I made great grades in school. I was a cheerleader. I had a lot of friends, even though I didn't feel popular. You know, I just led this amazing childhood, and, you know, my life took a turn, and I didn't wake up wanting to be a prostitute. I didn't wake up wanting to be a drug addict. I didn't wake up and say, oh, I just think I want to ruin my life today. Somebody helped me ruin it. While I was in jail, I mean, I think it was my 17th time in jail. I've been into jail a lot. So, you know, I felt like, okay, I'm here, I've got food to eat, I can take a shower, nobody's wanting sex from me, I don't have to do anything. Cry Freedom Missions started a jail ministry while I was there, and one of the things that Beverly and Jonathan first spoke about was forgiveness, and that we could all be forgiven, and it doesn't matter what you've done or where you came from, that you're still worthy. And I totally felt worthless, and to have these people come in and not ask me for anything and tell me that I'm worthy, you know, I didn't trust it at first because I have trust issues from, you know, my trafficking experience. So I watched them and I listened to what they had to say, and I finally realized that they were speaking truth. And, you know, I just couldn't believe that everybody else had walked away from me. Everybody had abandoned me, my family. I had burned every bridge that I had, and I couldn't believe that there was somebody right here in my face that didn't want anything in return from me but for me to do better. And so I took a chance, and Cry Freedom Missions helped me get an attorney. The attorney got me out, got me released from jail. Beverly was there to pick me up, and they took me directly to a Christian rehab, and I stayed there for 3 months. And when I finished that, I went to Anna's House, which is run by True Justice International. It's a safe house for women who have been involved in sex trafficking and human trafficking. And my whole stay ended up being 18 months, and it was so worth it because I was totally able to restore every detail of my life. My life now is amazing. It is so much more than I could have ever dreamed of. I have received legal custody back of my daughter. She's 11. I hadn't seen her in 8 years. She did not even know that I was her mother. I like to use my story as inspiration to others, because if I don't, then everything that happened to me would be for nothing. I am a North Carolina board certified peer support specialist, and I am a survivor of human trafficking.
I typically have just seen that it can be anyone. Just like the trafficker can be anyone, the victim can be anyone, and so can the buyer.
So these dates happened mostly in a military town. There was a lot of young airmen who were away from girlfriends, away from wives, what have not, you know, what have you. A lot of this stuff happened in military towns. And the range of customers is just unbelievable. I have had clients, you know, from pastors to magistrates to probation officers, people who are supposed to protect us, people who are supposed to help us in our times of need, taking advantage of me. So. And also other addicts and other people that were just like myself, but there is also, it could be your next door neighbor, married men, sometimes couples, men and women. There is no range. There is no range for the people that could be involved in buying trafficking victims.
When a minor is sold for sex, it's called the commercial sexual exploitation of children, or child sex trafficking. Sometimes the very people who are supposed to love and protect children are the ones who exploit them.
A lot of people don't realize that in the USA, that if you are under the age of 18 and you are being sexually exploited, you're having to exchange sex for anything. A lot of people say, well, maybe if they are doing it willingly, it's not human trafficking. That's not correct. That's another myth. In the USA, law says that anybody under the age of 18 that's exchanging sex for anything, maybe you have to help grandmama make the rent. Somebody's telling you to have sex for the rent, or you're having to exchange sex for a pair of tennis shoes or food or for drugs. Under the age of 18, if you're exchanging sex for anything, force, coercion, and fraud does not have to be involved. That's automatically considered human trafficking.
Intrafamilial trafficking is something that we had a hard time even fathoming. We just couldn't even imagine parents selling their children for either drugs, alcohol, or money, or sometimes for influence. But once you have spoken to children who become adults, who then begin to talk about being made available to other people, we begin to understand that a little bit better. When we see children who have been victims of intrafamilial trafficking, expecting them to make a disclosure is an unrealistic expectation. Many times the parental trafficker mixes love with fear, so that the child is cooperative because they want their pets to live, or because they want their mom not to be beaten up, or because you're my daddy and you really love me and it's just one more time. We can see all kinds of manipulation of young children and school-aged children in intrafamilial trafficking.
I was raised by an old North Carolina family. We went to church every Sunday. We lived in an upper middle class neighborhood in Raleigh. They presented a good front. They went to all the PTO meetings. They went to all the church meetings. I was 3 when he brought my cat. My sister and I each had a cat. And he brought my cat into the garage and said, "This is what will happen to you if you ever tell the things that are happening to you." And at the time, he initiated the digital touching, digital abuse. He had slit its neck, and it was dripping blood and dead. And he said, "That's what will happen to you if you tell." In Hawaii is when the exploitation started. It was a group that met at the ocean's front in a pineapple field. So you would go through all the dirt roads and everything of the pineapple field, and you would get to the ocean part. And it was a group of people that met, men and women. They started out scaring the kids, because as we drove down the road, they would had on Halloween costumes, scary ones, and they would be putting their faces in the windows and making scary sounds and kind of terrifying the kids. And so at that group meeting, which was pretty large, there were probably 30 to 40 people there, I was initiated into the things that were expected of me sexually, one of which was oral sex. And I bit his penis, and he jerked me up by the neck and started dunking me in the water. And I once again learned that they were the ones in control, not me. My father would announce at the dinner table that he was taking Vicky to a party. My mother took me in the bedroom and was getting me dressed to go, and she was putting on a sweater. And I said, please don't make me go. You don't know what they do there. Please don't make me go. And it's a very small house. He walked in, he heard, told me to get in the car. I got in the car. We drove there in stone silence. We got to the barn, and he went in and told the head guy. The head guy came up and shrieked in my ear, "You told." And then they hung me from a 2-story barn by my shoulders. Well, the ropes went under here. And they left me there most of the night. The next morning, my father came and took me down. He seemed to have one rule, which is, I can't kill him off. Virginia might have a hard time with that. And her family was influential. So he came and cut me off. He took me back home to my mother. I couldn't lift my arms to eat. My mother had to spoon feed me for like 2 days, and she never asked what happened. And I feel like she felt like she'd gotten in over her head and had no clue how to handle it. And the easiest way to handle it was to sacrifice her oldest child so she could protect the 3 younger ones, which is what I feel like she must have been thinking. We moved back to Raleigh. We moved to the neighborhood of Beck-Anna, which probably still is upper middle class. I went to junior high, and the principal was a pedophile, and he would have sexual encounters with me as well as a couple of other kids that were at the school. There was also a club that had my father in it, my uncle in it, who was an abuser, a bunch of other men who were abusers. They had regular meetings, a lot of which happened down at the State Theater that was down on State Street in Raleigh. And my father got me a job at age 16 working at the State Theater. But after that, in the nighttime, they would show porn films, and they would use us kids to service the people sitting there looking at the porn films. With the familial child, because they live in the home, it's really, really difficult to figure it out. It's been difficult. I didn't come out of this unscathed. I didn't come out of this perfectly whole, not like a child who was raised in a loving, righteous family. I came out of this as a traumatized child who has severe fear of abandonment. I have fear of everything. My life is basically good. I have a great family. They're not perfect. They all have different issues, but they're still a great family.
The number one way to traffic a child is through love, not through force.
People are always leery of the people they don't know, but it's the people that they do know that could be the very ones that could bring them into this type of bondage.
What we see instead is the grooming process, the getting to know you, getting to learn what your vulnerability points are.
Sometimes these electronics are becoming babysitters. So our youth are stuck in front of them all the time, and perpetrators know exactly where to target and what sites they're using and how to go about targeting them. Perpetrators have 24/7 access to our kids. Sometimes people will target impoverished areas just to recruit people to say, I have this car, I have, this nice item. And you live here, how can I help, how can I help you do better? Or if you live with me or go with me, then I can also get you some of those nice things. And a lot of times traffickers are targeting homeless youth shelters. And so a lot of their victims are there. And of course, if you're at your lowest point, if someone says, I want to help you, I'm going to come take you out or do something for you, and you haven't had someone do that for you in a very long time. Just imagine what that feels like to someone in that situation when someone does the smallest thing for them when they've had nothing.
And you kind of create this mental prison in your head that I can't leave, or I'm not worth anything anymore.
Traffickers are clever and employ a variety of methods to recruit or groom their victims, including promising romance, love or acceptance, exploiting a position of authority, exploiting a friendship or romantic relationship, getting to know a person and their vulnerabilities, offering a better lifestyle and independence, offering gifts, cash, or luxury items, exploiting vulnerabilities or desperation, meeting the need for food, clothing, or shelter, and flattery, lies, manipulation. These methods can be used in person or online.
The assumption is that traffickers are almost always going to be men and victims are almost always going to be women and girls. And though that is true in the majority of cases, we certainly have boys who are trafficked as well. The diversity of the traffickers and the diversity of the buyers are important things for us to realize so that we don't stereotype an individual and assume this cannot be a trafficker because traffickers look like this. On the streets, the individuals who are selling these girls and boys can be black, they can be white, they can be Italian, they can be Hispanic. There are many types of ethnicity and race.
I've been trafficked by females that want half of the money. Most of the time they had a habit to support themselves, and they thought they were helping me when in fact they weren't. They were just helping me to destroy my life. So men, women, black, white.
Trafficking is a very well recognized aspect of gang membership and the way that gangs make money. We do know that biker gangs are also associated with sex trafficking. And as I mentioned before, girls who are sold by gangs are expected to support the gangs through prostitution and or as victims of sex trafficking. There is no one type of offender, just like there's no one type of victim.
We have seen potential traffickers who have been in professional settings that have been doctors and lawyers. We have seen situations with significant red flags for trafficking where they were the patriarchs of the town, and it was a rural town where this person's family goes back generations. And we have also seen it where potential victims also become victimizers themselves.
We've brought those cases against crew leaders, many of whom are from the countries that our clients are also from. We have represented a significant number of survivors who were trafficked by a family member. When you first think about it, you're like, how could someone do this to a member of their own family? But when you take a step back, I think you can see how, who is going to know more about what your vulnerabilities are, maybe how to control you. The person most able to affect your community and your access to a safety net than maybe someone who is a little bit closer to you.
The different type of traffickers we've encountered have been across the spectrum of race and gender.
You see that there are a lot more traffickers who are male, but that doesn't discount that we have a lot of female traffickers as well. And so a lot of times I try to tell people, don't always look for what you think is the obvious choice, because sometimes it can be that female that's with that person who's talking for them, who looks like they're nurturing them, who's all along the person who's responsible for, the trauma and the pain that they're dealing with.
Sadly, there's no specific stereotype that you can say, oh, this is a trafficker. This is what they look like. This is what you look for. They're all shapes, all sizes, all colors, and they could be all around us.
Traffickers can look like anyone. They can be any age, they can be any race, they can be any socioeconomic status. I think the biggest thing is anyone who wants to exploit someone else is what a trafficker looks like.
We know that for most of these cases, it's not bars on the windows and chains and locks and physical force. traffickers are very savvy and they can use non-physical means of coercion to keep someone there.
You feel like you can't leave because this person knows where your family lives. We've had situations where things were just as benign as someone reaching into a console in their car and just putting a gun on the dashboard. Just being able to show a weapon is a statement in itself.
You know, I can think of almost every single client that we've encountered have had some kind of story where they've shared where they've been blackmailed by such videos that if they were ever ran away, those videos would be released to their family members. And so these are oftentimes used as a form of coercion to threaten them, to keep them in that lifestyle.
Victims of trafficking are not usually locked up or imprisoned. Instead, traffickers have developed powerful methods to keep their victims under control. These include withholding or providing drugs or alcohol, withholding or providing access to children, withholding or providing love and affection, threats of violence, threats against family, psychological manipulation, displaying weapons, physical force, blackmail with videos, threaten to report crime, threaten deportation, debt bondage, and isolation from support networks.
We have no certain look for a trafficking victim. I think with traffickers and victims, we get and we find what we're looking for. If we're only looking for, males of color to be traffickers, that's what we're going to find. If we're only looking for white females as trafficking victims, that's what we're going to find.
We do know that in the United States, children of color are overrepresented significantly as victims of sex trafficking. Partly because of poverty and impoverished communities, partly because of racism, partly because of the need for an individual the buyer, that is, to feel that they're not going to run into this child again because this child is discardable if they're very impoverished.
And we know that poverty is a key reason that people are being trafficked, whether it's because the families need things or because the person themselves need things. And sometimes they get in a situation because they were trying to have a need met again, and instead of getting that need met, they end up being trafficked.
Our office has represented both male and female victims of trafficking, and also adult and minor victims of trafficking. The majority of the survivors that we have represented are foreign nationals. We've represented survivors from Thailand, from Indonesia, from Mexico, from Guatemala, and from Honduras, and the United States, who've been survivors of trafficking.
So we certainly do see boys who are victims of this kind of crime, and it's hard for these boys to be able to talk about this because many of the survivor boys that I've spoken to who are now adult men speak of the fact of having talked with their own families about this and very often being derided or having been told it can't be true, you're a liar, you're ungrateful.
I've worked a lot with our Commission on Indian Affairs. I've also worked a lot with the missing and murdered Indigenous women groups across the country. And so we know that human trafficking is one of the #1 reasons that a lot of women and girls who are Native American or Alaska Native have gone missing and sometimes ended up being murdered. When we think about just the limited access to services that people who are within tribal and indigenous communities have, that's already another issue. The trust factor of not trusting some of the local service providers, not trusting local law enforcement, and then having all of these things happening, then they're not reporting it. One of the things that we have noticed is they have had a recent uptick in cases when it comes to when the casinos are kind of doing business on a regular basis, that they have started to see a lot more trafficking, especially since they've been doing a lot more training in that community.
I noticed some signs that were relatable to all the cases. It was the teenagers or the individuals who were vulnerable. A lot of people were involved in addiction. They were involved in the LGBTQ community. They were involved in the foster care system.
I think that when we talk about trafficking, we know that there are some populations that are a little bit more vulnerable. While we know that anyone could be a victim of trafficking, we know that our youth are definitely one of the largest populations that are targeted. Specifically because just being, under the age of 18 makes people vulnerable to being trafficked. LGBTQ youth are already isolated from their families. A lot of times, not only being isolated, but just the guilt, the shame, the fear, the things that they are experiencing already make them a little bit more vulnerable to being targets of not only trafficking, but domestic violence, sexual assault. And so, yeah, they're definitely more, I would say, more vulnerable than a lot of other groups. One of the cases, I guess, that I always think about is a person who was transgender. And thinking about some of the issues and the needs that that person had, it was just, the first thing was having someone believe them.
Many times with the individuals that we have helped, sometimes as young 6, 7, 8 years old, they've been molested, they've been abused in some way. Many of them are in the foster care system. Many of them have had just broken homes. I'll never forget one young lady, she reached out and to my horror, as she began to talk about what had happened to her, she was retelling the story of her 6-year-old self and her mother forcing her to have sex with their drug dealer.
Farm workers, migrant farm workers in particular, are vulnerable to human trafficking. Migrant farm workers, for example, are leaving the safety and the community that they know, where they know to get help, with a promise of opportunity in a foreign place. They're uprooting their lives, often traveling without their families to go follow the planting and the harvest season. So the combination of all of these things, sort of the newness to the community, a really extraordinary amount of control by one entity, the fact that they really are sort of hidden or separated from the community around them, create kind of like the perfect storm. And so I believe as a result of those things, we have seen trafficking here in farm work in North Carolina.
Anyone can be a victim of human trafficking, but some people are more at risk than others. Some of the vulnerable populations include youth, anyone under 18, indigenous or native people, victims of child sexual abuse, members of the LGBTQI community, foster care kids, juvenile justice offenders, homeless people, those with mental health issues, those with substance abuse issues, runaways, those living in an unstable family environment, people living in poverty, those with a language barrier, low-income earners, anyone who is new to a community, anyone who lacks social support, undocumented workers, and anyone with learning disabilities or developmental delay. The spread of myths and false information about human trafficking harms victims, survivors, and the entire anti-human trafficking movement. Awareness isn't the end goal. People need to be armed with facts to fight human trafficking. As a movement, we need to combat misinformation about human trafficking with diligence and persistence.
There are a lot of myths that are out there that are surrounding human trafficking that I feel, and I know a lot of people that do this work feel, are very harmful not only to the work, but also, more importantly, to survivors of human trafficking. There's the things where there's, these online stores that they're saying have merchandise that are named after children that are being shipped out to places with people inside of suitcases and cabinets and all of these things. So many different conspiracy theories of people who are adamant that all trafficking happens with white vans, with people driving those. So many different pieces of miseducation out there. So I think it's so important for us to take some time to educate ourselves about what trafficking really is and what it really looks like, because a lot of those myths and things that are out there can do so much more harm than good.
We rarely see kidnapping. If you're kidnapping someone, then people are hopefully out looking for that person.
I always say if they kidnapped them, it's they kidnapped their mind, but not their body.
I began to realize that all the things that I encountered and experienced overseas was taking place right here in our communities. And that kind of took my breath away. I mean, it really did, because I grew up around here. I mean, I went to school and graduated high school in North Carolina, and so in my mind's eye, it was always somewhere else. And then the reality hit, that it was here. And it was in abundance, in places that, with people that I had known in school, people that lived down the road from us, that lived in our neighborhoods. And it was not just touching the low social economic class. It was not just touching one particular race. It was touching everyone.
What is the difference between smuggling and human trafficking? Is it the same thing? And no, smuggling is a crime against our country's borders, where someone is brought in illegally to come into the country to live and work in the country. What often happens, though, is that there is a vulnerability, or what can happen is that there is a heightened level of vulnerability that can be exploited, where that smuggling situation and the person being smuggled in is now wholly at the mercy of this smuggler or coyote, and now can be forced into other situations because they have no means to protect themselves.
When it comes to human trafficking and sex trafficking, a lot of people think that transportation outside of a city or outside of a state or outside of a country has to take place for human trafficking or sex trafficking to be involved. And that is just a myth. You know, there does not have to be any transportation for that to take place.
When someone is trying to get out of that situation, they may not recognize that they have been potentially trafficked. Or sometimes situations where potential victims don't want assistance because it makes them feel more of a victim.
Getting a survivor to self-identify is sometimes almost impossible. A lot of times a young girl or a young guy, they don't even recognize fully that they're being trafficked. They don't even understand what the definition of trafficking is.
We do see that trafficking victims do not self-identify. Guilt, the shame, the fact that they felt like it was their fault. They feel like they did something wrong, not that something wrong has been done to them. I think one other thing that gets left out of the discussion a lot is male survivors. I think it is so important to help people understand that male victims are real. It's something that happens all the time, because then we can help normalize reporting for males and actually having them stand up and say, this is happening to me also. Because we know that, you know, on average about 30% of trafficking survivors are male. But we're not talking about it, so we don't identify them, and they don't feel comfortable coming forward a lot because of the stigma around it.
What can you do to help stop human trafficking? Keep your eyes open for people displaying these red flags: nervous, anxious, or depressed demeanor, no eye contact, communication barriers, fearful of boss or manager, fearful of authorities, not allowed or not able to speak for themselves, have little or no money, can't leave the job site or house alone, clothing inappropriate for age, weather, or situation, much older romantic partner, chronic runaway, lack of control over his or her schedule, money, or identification, gang affiliation, substance use or abuse, unexplained travel, tattoos, microderm piercings, changes in academic performance, changes in friend groups or support network, identification documents held by third party, don't know where they've been, can't give you an address, no idea what time it is, unexplained injuries, wear same clothes over and over, unexplained absences from school or work, use of prostitution terminology such as daddy, the life, or wifey, living where they work, transported by employer to and from work, overcrowded living conditions, unusual security measures, must pay deposit to be hired, owes money to their employer, undernourished, unaddressed health conditions, and multiple hotel key cards.
One of the things we do want to encourage is that you don't attempt to act by yourself.
If you notice that it's a situation and someone looks like they may be in danger, do not try to jump in or do anything, but call 911. We want to help people, but it's so important to think about it, even if you're like, I can do this and I'm not scared, but think about the person and the harm that you're doing to that person, because if the trafficker figures out that they've talked to you or that anything like that has happened, then a lot of times they will be either beaten or they could be, something as serious as being killed because of a conversation that they had. So you want to be careful. Not only are you putting them at risk, but you're also putting yourselves at risk. And so please be careful. Do not, go and try to interrupt or break into a situation that you think might be a trafficking situation, but call people who are trained and professionals who are used to doing this kind of work.
North Carolina law requires that the National Human Trafficking Hotline be posted in many public places and businesses. North Carolina has a partnership with the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Calls from North Carolina received by the hotline are forwarded to appropriate law enforcement and service providers so that cases are investigated and victims are served as quickly as possible. So what can you do? Speak out. Here's how. Pay attention to what's happening around you and report red flag behavior. Don't wait to call for help. Report as soon as possible. Every minute counts. Don't approach the victim or the trafficker. Doing so can endanger you and the victim. Call 911. That is the fastest way to get help. Don't worry about being wrong. Your call may save a life. Call the Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-3737-888. If you can safely take a photo, do so. Human trafficking is a scourge, and you have the power to help stop it just by having the courage to speak out.
Community members can do a lot of things. They have a lot of powers that we all don't have. One thing that they have is a power to, really push their legislators on policy changes, law changes that would actually make things a lot easier. So stay informed on different policies and legislative issues that are happening, and then help support your local programs who may have funding that restricts their ability to comment or say anything as it comes to, as it relates to legislative changes. The manpower. A lot of our service providers don't have the capacity to provide any sort of, resources or services outside of kind of their normal everyday thing. But a lot of our community members have businesses, churches that can help with donations. No one agency can do it alone. We need the support of the community.
Community members are incredibly impactful and needed to have a voice in ending human trafficking. We cannot do this alone without you. We ourselves are community members as well, and we need to have that holistic support from our neighbors, from our family, from our community itself. And so one of the things definitely I want to encourage is to speak out. Speak out of what you're seeing. Speak out when you feel like something's wrong. And being able to connect with those in your network. Create that network that you can problem solve some things with, of saying, hey, I saw this. Does this feel wrong to you too? That you can then speak out, and you can call your local law enforcement with the Crime Stoppers. You can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and they can help you walk through what you may have seen and whether that needs to be reported in situation as well.
We need to speak out. If you see something, you need to do something. You need to contact authorities. You need to contact the national hotline, and also get involved. Get involved. Get involved and volunteer. Get involved with your dollars to reach out. You know, you may not necessarily want to go out with a group like Cry Freedom Missions at 2 o'clock in the morning and face a gun, face a pimp, face a John. But what you can do is get behind these groups with your prayers, with your volunteerism, with your giving, and say, look, I want to not only speak out, but speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, and get involved so that we can see this modern day slavery abolished here in North Carolina.
When you know about it, when you learn one thing about trafficking, tell it to someone else. Take that time to speak out. Help our communities. You don't know if that one person you tell is a person who could have been a victim, or it could be that one person you tell tells one other person who could have been, you could have prevented them from being trafficked. When we're thinking, oh, it doesn't happen here, or it doesn't happen in my neighborhood, or it would never happen over here, those are the things that keep us from being able to identify what trafficking truly is and what it looks like, and to be able to help all the people that we want to help.
When we look at human trafficking, we see it as an onion. You start to pull back the strips and you start to see that there's more going on underneath. Definitely, please speak out, be aware, be able to educate yourself, be able to talk with your friends and family, and create that sense of community, because you yourself may be the changing force for someone's life.
Now you know. Human trafficking is here in North Carolina, and it could be in your backyard. And you can speak out and be the one to be the voice for the voiceless. If you know someone who needs to understand human trafficking better, I hope that you will share this film with them. And if you know professionals that work with vulnerable populations, I hope that you will refer them to us so we can assist them in getting additional training. If we all work together, we can end human trafficking. I hope that you will join the anti-human trafficking movement here in North Carolina. Now you know. What will you do?